I'm sharing this message with you in a sadly unremarkable and yet really bizarre time. A time when the world is racked with COVID-19, with all of its disruptions and its question marks. A time when pain and anger are exploding in response to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. A time when it's probably envious to be a political or economic leader facing populations who are looking for direction, for answers, for the space just to self-define and feel safe and feel secure. And yet I say it's unremarkable because this isn't the first time. It's unlikely to be the last. It's not normal, but it's certainly not unusual. The other year, it was the threat of climate change, or it was Brexit, or it was Ebola, or his name was Michael Brown, who was murdered at 18, or his name was Jordan Edwards, who was gunned down when he was just 15. Or the crisis was, brown migrant bodies on northbound red boats. It's unremarkable, and in fact, it's disturbingly usual. We seem to be in some kind of a holding pattern of crisis response, which is in fact quite predictable. In foresight, it's what we might term predeterminable elements or variables, what you may understand as the certainty of change. So acknowledging the usualness of this bizarreness, however, does require us to deal with some of the same old usual problems that bedevil us. It's inconvenient, but it forces us to confront our nasty, annoying little nows if we have any hope of survival in these uncertain futures. And so we know, for example, that numerous futurists actually warned of these pandemics of this nature, and yet we somehow failed to shift our usual behaviors and tendencies. So my contribution from an anticipatory perspective has been to use cities as a heuristic for how we think about the big now issues and what those might be for the future. And I have three big propositions in that regard. Firstly, we are in desperate need of new imaginaries. As with our infrastructure and architecture and spatial forms, the answers to our current issues no longer lie reliably in historic planning models and patterns. We need new systems. We need new and better ways and means of doing all sorts of things, of relating, of exchanging, of valuing life and planet. And all around us, there are new and changing conditions and technologies that both demand and enable novel response. So yes, we may have the planning and preparation that ironically were the product of industrial era pandemics, and those have been useful in their modern form. However, they require much innovation and we need additional new emergent perspective. And COVID's shown us several possibilities of new ways of addressing the challenges, be it urban pollution and congestion, more efficient uses of digital platforms, rethinking our assumptions about urban densities. So number one, we need to build new capabilities to imagine different and unprecedented futures. UNESCO's Futures Literacy Program is doing great work in this regard. We've seen pilots in Africa. More in that regard is required. Secondly, we need new processes that are vastly more inclusive and participatory. We are all increasingly aware of how important it is to co-design and co-produce actions and responses with the communities we work with in order to succeed. However, what COVID showed in South Africa, what it exposed was the usual crippling tendency of formal organizations and agencies to stifle even the most positive, gap-filling grassroots responses by communities. And so, partnerships, co-production, human-centered design, valuing diversity, endogenous knowledges, these can't just be politically correct terms that we throw into policies and plans. They need to mean something and they need to become crucial in building our resilience to uncertain futures. So that's number two. Our processes have to be more inclusive. And finally, we need to rethink our institutions. How can we transform these bureaucratical, hierarchical, egocentric institutions into forms that can be responsible and wise, but also agile and responsive in times of change and uncertainty. So if you take a minute to think about an earthquake resilient building, it's not one that's stronger in the sense of being made more rigid and more unwavering. It's one that's designed with a range of seismic shifts and movements in mind. Can we do that? Can we imagine that? If I were to use a biblical metaphor, you can't put old wine in new wineskins. Can we think about that? So some of the global COVID responses really felt reminiscent of watching the docudrama Chernobyl, where you had these centrist tendencies and debilitating power structures that can literally trump any logic or evidence and jeopardize real lives. What would it look like not to accept this? what would it look like to try and change that? So in conclusion, my thoughts about how we could posture differently towards the future is that we need to experiment with building new imaginaries. We need to engage people and nations, regions, communities, neighbors, peers differently. And we need to organize ourselves and act differently institutionally.